and talking about the text traditions that we're working on and realizing we're all working on material text traditions in one way or the other. And we thought, why don't we do things together?
So hi Dirk, it's great to see you here in Beijing again.
Hi Emre, thanks for having me.
And I'm glad we have this chance to talk a little bit.
Yes.
And well, one thing, I heard you give a talk about your research earlier, and I wanted to ask you again, like in front of the camera, like, what is it that you're doing in terms of research? So what are the questions that you're focusing on? What exciting projects are going?
Yes, no, thank you so much. That's so kind of you to ask. So for those who don't know me, I'm in Chinese philosophy. And I've always been interested in the materiality of knowledge production. And materiality means various things. It can mean, of course, the materiality of media change, when things become written, when a manuscript culture becomes more mature, when information is becoming more easily available, but also materiality in terms of the social fabric of society, and how that implicates on what we do in philosophy and how texts change due to the factors that we expose ourselves to, but also the text that we read. So my research is interested in how does argumentation in early China work in Chinese philosophy, and for that I tend to look at manuscript texts from the Warring States period. That's sort of the second half of the first millennium BC, because those texts that we get from the ground, we do know, to the best of our knowledge, that they have not been tampered with later on, because the transmitted texts have, of course, gone through the hands of later editors over multiple generations. So we don't really know, when we see a pre-imperial text, when it was actually fabricated and whether it really was pre-imperial. However, if we get a text from the ground, then we do know that the tomb was sealed 300 BC, so it is thought from pre-300 BC. And I'm working on various actually exciting projects, if I may say so, at the moment. One of the projects is I'm interested in silent argumentation. And silent argumentation means that, of course, Chinese philosophy is governed by a logic, but it's not necessarily Aristotelian logic. And many of the texts are very acutely aware that the moment you put an idea as a proposition, that you are endangering the idea, because there will be always two things, the idea and the proposition, and that the two can never really meet. Whereas some texts, then, knowing the danger of language that seeks to define an object, try to find new ways of expressing what they're about or what they're up to by embodying the idea in the structure of the text, such that the text is re-performing or make you as a reader perform the idea in yourself as you go and read the text. So that's one project that I'm currently working on. And the other project, which is also very close to my heart, and I've been thinking of that for ages, has the title Confucius Superstar. And what I am interested in is, if you think, Confucius died maybe in 479 BC. By 350 BC, Confucius is literally everywhere. It is hard to make a philosophical claim without positioning yourself either against or with or within the words of Confucius. And if you think that China at the time was sort of maybe a mature enough manuscript culture, but information spread must have been rather limited. So what I'm interested in is, how is it possible that in the span of 150 years at most, Confucius rose from relative obscurity to the absolute philosophical superstar that he became and still is today? And so that is the second project that I'm currently working on.
Okay, but isn't that kind of the pattern with most world thinkers that, after their death, within 150 years or so, they kind of suddenly boom and expand?
Yes and no. That is true, but if you, for instance, compare Confucius and Socrates, you see quite a difference in that Socrates, of course, is now the Greek philosopher and the model that we think of when we think of Greek philosophy. But Socrates never rose to the same fame in such a short time as compared to Confucius. And Socrates never held that authoritative place within the tradition that Confucius now holds, and in 300 BC already was holding in China. That I think is quite unusual. And so interestingly is that if you think how fast would a manuscript spread and a manuscript travel and therefore ideas spread, then I do think it's worth looking at how is it possible that within that span of 130, 150 years, Confucius just became that bang superstar that he is today and was back then.
And you also mentioned that these excavated texts, they haven't been tampered with. So you basically see transmitted literature as something that has been tampered with?
So I do think that when we think of early China, that the term pre-Qin literature is an oxymoron. There is no pre-Qin literature because everything was rewritten during the early empires, and that is of course due to the burning of the libraries after the war, but also the fact that there was this quest for stable ideas that of course didn't exist in the Warring States period to that extent. So I do think that whatever we get as transmitted literature is in one way or another rewritten, as is true of our own tradition too.
Okay, what do you mean by own tradition?
Sorry, as it is true of all the thinkers that we take for granted if we come from the Western tradition. So, for instance, Aristotle. Aristotle is famous for his essays, so to speak. But of course, Aristotle also produced dialogues. But he didn't need to be remembered for his dialogues because Plato covered that space. So when the Aristotle that we encounter today is not the historical Aristotle, but it's the Aristotle that later generation found worthy of transmitting and remembering. And that is true, I think, of all generations. Now, in the Chinese case, we have this beautiful opportunity of all these new text finds that allow us to just jump those generations of later thinkers that thought to correct, maybe even heal those texts from faults as they saw it. And we moved back right to when they were put into the ground. That does not make those texts better or worse. It's just simply a different snapshot in the history that we get to see. And okay. I find that moment exciting.
No, I think so, yeah. And so another question that I wanted to ask you, you kept today in our conversations, you kept returning to this idea that how many important texts are in China being discovered, like manuscripts that are coming out from the pre-modern period, compared to, say, the Western tradition. Right?
Yes. So I think that is something that I find quite astonishing. And the wealth of written records that we have in China is extraordinary. And also the ignorance in the West about what treasures there are in China in terms of its written record is also extraordinary. So I don't know, your audience will not know this. I'm also an editor of a journal in Oxford, the Journal for Manuscript and Text Cultures, which is the journal of the Center for Manuscript and Text Cultures. And I'm currently preparing a special issue that thinks about the most important text finds in the last 200 years globally. And I do hope that in that special journal we can give a special place to some of the collections that we have. Of course, that will not be a proportional representation, because otherwise half of the journal would be covered by China, but at least it will give more of a window of what it is that we have in China to audiences that would otherwise find it more difficult to access the materials in China and get maybe a good introduction. So it is maybe at this stage, even though I think nobody has an excuse not to know the wealth that we have in China, but it is still difficult for us as, say, Europeans or Americans sitting outside of China to really appreciate the scope of what we've got. But if we are able to sort of have a journal issue, or maybe a series of journal issues that talk about global heritage over the last 200 years and the most important text finds, then we've got a convenient tool, even though I don't like that term, for people sitting outside of China to sort of look at some of the amazing text finds that we have got in China.
I mean, why do you think people are not aware of this, the quantity of materials that are coming out in China?
That is a good question. Let me ask you a different question instead. Why is it that I do philosophy, I do Chinese philosophy, and why is it that today I still have, on a near daily basis in Europe, the conversation whether China has philosophy, and how it is that there is a tradition that claims to have philosophy but doesn't even have a word for philosophy, didn't even give it a linguistic representation. And of course that is nonsense. Of course China had a word for its what they are doing. And of course there was perhaps not sort of a disciplinary account about philosophy as a discipline, but it doesn't say that they didn't have the discipline of philosophy. So the fact that on a daily basis I still have in Oxford and elsewhere conversations about whether China actually does have philosophy maybe answers that question.
That's true,
Because
yeah.
everybody who wants to know, or who is open enough to realize that there are thought traditions outside the Aristotelian ones, ought to know that China has a very rich tradition of philosophy, and yet we have that conversation on a daily basis. So maybe that explains it partly, that we still have such ignorance in the West about the rich traditions that we find in China. I don't think it is the Chinese fault only that it is not known in the West to an extent that it maybe ought to be known.
Yeah. Okay, and I also wanted to ask you about your center, right?
Thank you.
Like what you're leading, or you founded it or co-founded it?
Yes, so the Center for Manuscript and Text Cultures is based at the Queen's College in the University of Oxford. And we started in 2012 with just a couple of fellows realizing that we're interested in similar ideas. But my friends and fellows at Queen's, Charles Crowther was one of the first ones. He is in ancient history and epigraphy in Oxford. John Baines, the famous Egyptologist at Queen's, and Angus Bowie, a famous classicist at Queen's. We were sitting over dinner actually and talking about the text traditions that we're working on, and realizing we're all working on material text traditions in one way or the other. And we thought, why don't we do things together? And then one thing very quickly led to another, and we became sort of a small group running workshops. And in the beginning, we were called the Workshop for Manuscript and Text Cultures. And then in, I must now lie, 2018 it was, that we had become established enough that we proposed to the governing body of the Queen's College to support us financially also. And at that time, we got a very generous grant from the fellows of the college to have a seed con funding over 8 years. and to establish ourselves as a center that looks at material text cultures across the globe, with the understanding that after 8 years we either cease to exist or have found another income or resources that enable us to continue. So we've been quite productive in fundraising, and if any of your listeners has any to spare, then please, we are always in need of more, not because we want to live a pleasant life, but really because we want to push the agenda of bringing different text cultures into a conversation. And that is because I found that I can only really appreciate Chinese textuality if I have a bit of an understanding of textualities outside of China, because that only enables me to understand what is specific about China and what is common with other text traditions. And I think my fellow colleagues with whom I started the center felt the same, that the more they learn about China, the more they appreciate the text cultures that they're actually studying. And so perhaps each one of us kept their interest in the culture that they were studying, but they all thought it is beneficial for the object of their study if they also knew more about neighboring cultures, traditions, and text cultures. And that is how the whole thing started. So we now run a yearly conference where we discuss various specific matters of early textualities. The last conference, for instance, that we held last year in Oxford was Gendered Silence in Manuscript Cultures. The year before that, we had mathematical music in manuscript cultures. We had a conference on the topic of poetic traditions in manuscript cultures and how that unfolds, etc., etc. So we hope to gather ideas for conferences every year and bring a group of scholars in from across the world with different backgrounds and different material text cultures to be both general enough that people not studying their subject can understand what they mean, but be specific enough that they can articulate new ideas within their own tradition that they're studying. So that is one of the things that we do. Another thing is we have a platform where we give young scholars the opportunity to present their work to an audience that is not familiar with their object of study. And so have a platform where you know that you've got a beneficial audience, but critical nonetheless. And another element that we have is the special lecture series that we hold every term, where we invite people with great ideas to come to Oxford and give a lecture on what they do. But also we have just started a new lecture series on the question of unprovenanced manuscripts and the ethics of using them, because that is, of course, a contested issue across different cultures. And if you think of early China, you can't claim to do early China, I think, and ignore non-provenance manuscripts. Of course, I know that there are voices that would dispute this, and the idea of this platform is that we bring voices together that may not want to agree necessarily, but discuss these matters in a strongly methodological context such that it doesn't become personal, but it's always the idea that we do it for the subject, that not for our own ego. So I think the ethos of the Center for Manuscript and Text Cultures, if there is one, is we're all equal before the book, and the best argument wins. That's, I think, what we try to do. And then, of course, at the center of the center, at the center of the center, if I may, is our journal. So we have a open access journal, which is double peer reviewed, interdisciplinary in focus. And the beauty is we publish under SharePoint, which means that the authors who publish in our journal keep the copyright. And the idea of our journal was we need to be totally radically grassroots in that sense. Because if you think of how, at least in the United Kingdom, currently publication works, is that publishing houses make a massive fortune. Not that I'm against people making a massive fortune, they should, but at the moment we've got this double firewall, if you like. So if you're not at a wealthy university, it is very difficult with the open access policies in the United Kingdom to really be in the field and publish, because if you want to publish open access, and nowadays all you have to do is, in terms of journal publications, is open access, then you need to pay the journals a handsome amount that you get into an open access journal. And the same is true that on the other side, that you need to have sort of accounts that you can access those. So we wanted to break this double firewall and really make scholarship democratic, in the sense that if you've got a good idea and you have something to publish, we don't charge, and you don't and you don't pay. So everybody downloads what they find interesting from that journal, and at the same time everybody publishes in the journal without having to pay a fee or have the university pay a fee. Now, what we also try, or what we do try in that journal, is we try to generate a language, and that is a language where we can actually start to compare the different text cultures with one another, because at the moment we still have a terminology that not everybody understands, and some technical terms mean something very different in different text traditions, at least in the study of them. And so the idea is that we generate a language that becomes comparable across the borders of the subject, so that we can really begin to have conversation. And the other thing that we also hope is we want to play a bit with technical possibilities in the journal. That is, we want to see how we can even bring maybe an object into the journal, such that you have an object and you can turn it around and see what's on the other side of the manuscript that perhaps you discuss in this, or that you maybe even walk into a chamber and look around and see the object. So we hope to play a bit with three-dimensional digital tools in the journal, as well as have a paper version of it, so that in whatever 200 years people can still read the ideas that some of our authors had. So that's at least the idea behind it.
All right. Actually, that's all the time that I have today, because my plane leaves.
Yes. Well, have a good trip back home, and thank you so much for your time, Imre. I'm really happy
thank you for agreeing to talk to me. It's wonderful.
My pleasure.
It's always good to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you, and hopefully soon back in Oxford as well.
Yes. All right.
Yeah, thank you.
You.